Hi there, welcome back to Apatros Review. This episode, The Eye. Original English title, Seeing Ghosts. That's what it looks like. Directed by the Pang brothers in 2002. Now hi there, welcome back to Apatros Review, your guide to the wild world of science fiction action horror cinema with me, your host, Millie Sipka. If you want to spell my name, just look at the channel name. Now in this episode we look at a little bit of Asian horror films with Seeing Ghosts. That's what the original title translated to English means. Or for English markets just known as The Eye. For some reason, that's what the English language prints have. For some reason. Now, this is a Hong Kong-Singapore co-production with some scenes shot in Thailand, and was directed by Danny and Oxide Pang, a pair of identical twin brothers who previously made films like Bangkok Dangerous. Now, this was their debut in the horror genre. Now, the film premiered in Hong Kong on the 9th of May 2002. It then premiered in the UK on the 27th of September 2002 and played in the US for the first time on the South by Southwest Film Festival on the 8th of March 2003. In the US, the release was basically a few festival screenings and had a very limited release a few months down the track. Anyway, now the DVD I'm reviewing is of the Australian DVD from Eastern Eye, if you look at it. I don't know if you can see the cover. And this disc is multi-regional, so if you want to get it, it's fine. Because some of the Asian DVDs out there have some really bad compression, so just to let you know. And this disc, the only requirement you need is if you have NTC TV to make sure it's power compatible. And has subtitles, so. Now, the J-horror fad of the early 2000s had a flow-on effect on other Asian countries, allowing places like Korea and Hong Kong, that's South Korea by the way, to take chances and put out onto the international market their own ghost stories. It is quite interesting to compare the cultural differences between the ghost stories that each country was filming, but there really wasn't that much of a difference to note significantly. Seeing Ghosts, known as English market as The Eye, was a 2002 co-production between Hong Kong and Singapore, and was seen shot in Thailand, and was the horror debut of the identical twins Danny and Oxide Pang, who had previously made the well-regarded Thailand-made thriller Bangkok Dangerous. The Pang twins based their film on the true story of a blind woman who had just received a cornea transplant allowing her to see, but who was unable to cope with the overwhelming feeling of sight, and about a week after the surgery had killed herself. The Pangs wondered about what could have possibly driven the poor woman to take her own life, and so decided to turn that true story into a supernatural horror film about Moon, a young woman who, after 19 years of blindness, she lost her sight at a very young age after an accident, finally gets a cornea transplant, and while trying to adjust to the newfound feeling of sight, begins to see, and strangely enough also hear, the unquiet spirits of the recently dead, something that a doctor, after initially disbelieving her, finally gets convinced and commits an act of professional misconduct, in a way, by accessing the confidential file of the deceased cornea donor, who was a young woman with the gift of second sight, who killed herself after being labeled a witch and then shunned by her local village in rural Thailand, especially after predicting a major disaster in the village. Now, armed with this information, Moon and the doc head to the village to investigate the suicide and find some way of bringing the donor's spirit in peace. Now, I've always been of the opinion that much of the Asian horror films that came out in the wake of the progenitor of the fad, Hideo Nakata's overrated piece of hokum known as Ring, or for the American remake of Ring, was a very good film and completely outgunned the original. Now, most of these films were mostly mediocre films that didn't quite know how to scare Western audiences who were accustomed to much superior American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand films that actually had the smarts and sophistication to scare such audiences. Whereas Asian horror films, save for a handful of surprisingly good examples like the zombie yakuza film Versus and Takashi Shimizu's June films, the Grudge films, those ones were quite good, but the rest of them were mostly supernatural mysteries based around about putting a tormented soul to rest, only with the horror element awkwardly grafted on in an attempt to scare people. Something that, despite the reputation of most of these films, doesn't really do much. In fact, looking back on these films a good 20 or so years after the release, in fact, The Eye actually came out in 2002, so it's basically 19 years old, next to be 20 years old. Now, looking back on these films, a good 20 or so years after the fad, seems to confirm as most of the Asian horror films made back then haven't quite attained that cult classic reputation that most Western horror films of the same period have attained by today's standards, well, except for Ring and Ju-on. Now, as for Seeing Ghosts, or The Eye, whichever title you prefer, this is essentially a supernatural mystery thriller with an overriding sense of creepiness that, surprisingly enough, works rather well. If anything else, if nothing else, the Pangs do know how to to create an air of unease, although some of the audio signposting is really over the top, with some decent scenes showing the everyday encounters that Moon has with the ghosts. The schoolboy car accident victim, the ghost boy with the baseball cap looking for his lost report card, the old man with part of his face missing who floats around in the elevator, the young hospital patient friend who later dies of brain cancer, and the woman in the restaurant with a long CGI tongue. Which shows that unlike most Western movies, the ghosts of the Eastern world don't particularly like hurting people, and are mostly just benign, but they do have their fair share of unfinished business. Above those black shadow figures that you see in the film are actually known in Taoist religion as Black Reapers, beings who escort the spirits to the afterlife. Unfortunately, the film's marketing as a horror film does it a great disservice. Aside from the few creepy moments that make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, this isn't particularly scary. Although some people do get creeped out by some of those. I mean, they're creepy, but they're not that flat scary. Still, it is a solid entry in the Asian ghost story fad, and some people think this is Japanese, but it's actually from Hong Kong and co-produced with Singapore, so that's why it's not J-horror, this film. And it's a solid entry, and it will probably be putting off that cornea transplant you're planning to get. Now, Seeing Ghosts, or The Eye, sits on the B rung of my grading ladder. It's a solid supernatural mystery, but not really a horror flick. Of course, and by the way, if you're the squeamish type and this film scares you, then something like The Grudge will literally kill you. I mean, The Grudge was a very scary film. That was actually one of the best J-horror films I've ever seen. Yeah, that was actually a pretty good film. I'll review that in the future. But it's a mystery film. So, like Ring was pretty much overrated crud, and I already reviewed that. And yeah, just Eyes, that's what it is. I mean, it's a solid film, but it's more of a supernatural mystery. It's not really meant to scare you that much. It's not really a horror film. Now, there's some gnarly looking mediocre for the time CGI effects, like burns and the guy with half his face missing, but this isn't really supposed to be gory. No nudity either. Now for the DVD. So it looks like. Now this this DVD was one of those early 2000s Eastern Eye DVDs that were released in Australia from Madman Entertainment. But this film, unlike some other films, this has a pretty decent looking anamorphic 185 print. Asian DVDs of this film have suffered from bad compression. So if you're buying copies of this film from Hong Kong or Thailand or whatever, don't. They're very bad picture quality. The Australian disc is multi-regional, so if you have a NTSC TV, you might want to check its power compatible. And the soundtrack has a Cantonese 5.1 and DTS 5.1 Cantonese that sound good as well. The subtitles also well written, and the supplement is fairly reasonable for this market, with 2 featurettes, including standard BTS, behind the scenes, 2 trailers, 2 teasers, a TV spot, and usual Madman propaganda preview trailers. There's also an Easter egg, which, if you want to get it, just look at the extras menu and just highlight any of the options and extras, and just press left, and you'll highlight the Chinese title for the Eye, which is on the left side of the screen. Sometimes it gets blurred because of the motion effects, but once you get on that, press play, and you'll just get the static page of the DVD credits. That's it. I wish there was other Easter eggs, but that's the only one there. For the menu design, it's actually pretty creepy. It looks pretty good. Okay, so The Eye pretty much gets a B. It's a solid film, but it's not that particularly scary. It's not really a horror film. It's just a supernatural mystery film. That's what it is. And this is actually a good DVD to get if you want the film. I will review these. It's had 2 sequels to date and a remake. I already reviewed the remake some time ago. I think last year, yeah. And yeah, I'll review the first remake, The Eye 2, sometime in the future. in the coming weeks or so. Okay, so that's it for that one. Now, I don't do requests, but if you want to know if a particular film in my collection, or if you have a certain theme that you want me to cover, just hit me up in the comments section, and I'll get back to you. Also, if you have any questions about DVDs, I'll let you know. Okay, hope you're enjoying yourselves. Take care, take it easy, and that's it for this review. And by the way, my 200th episodes, my 200th review is next episode. How's that? Let me see ya.